Starting? Yes. Well, hello there, everyone. Kristi here with another hangout, which I'm sure will be fascinating and an interesting conversation for you to not really eavesdrop on because we're putting out in public, but we're having a conversation more for ourselves. And I think this is going to be an interesting conversation, and we want to share it with our audience members as well. So welcome to my channel, Pascal Leroux. He's got his own channel here on YouTube, and he's had an interesting story in terms of his process of being on YouTube, and we've interacted on social media and sort of through comments, but this is our first time talking face-to-face. Is that digitally face-to-face? I don't know how I would say it, but yeah, first, welcome and thanks for coming on and having this chat.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you want to tell a little bit about your channel and then maybe the story of how your channel has kind of come to focus on the things that it has now.
Sure. Well, my channel is focusing primarily on topics that I've sort of been interested in, and one of the things I've been interested in primarily has been the transition that I've made in terms of becoming a quote-unquote skeptic, or you might, have labeled me as an anti-SJW at the time. But I went through this phase where I started off so a bit of backstory here. Like, I started off with, the usual people in terms of like atheism, because I was sort of going through a time period where I was questioning certain beliefs and stuff like that. And
like Thunderfoot. Oh yeah, I was like Thunderfoot, TJ, but you were going more highbrow.
Yeah, those were more secondary sources. Like,
sure.
I first started off with Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, looking at the debates, and then came more the Thunderfoots and Sargon of Akkad's and Armored Skeptics and that sort of thing. On the skepticism front, it was more James Randi and Penn and Teller, who were sort of like the people that I would go to. But then something weird happened. I think it was like about the time with Gamergate and everything like that, and people started talking about feminists and how they were evil and all that sort of stuff. And they bring up Anita Sarkeesian, how feminism was, they weren't quite at the tinfoil hat point where they were like saying it was going to destroy Western civilization, but they weren't happy. And, I was kind of like, yeah, what they're saying kind of makes sense. But, you're probably asking yourself, why would somebody who's been looking at, free thinkers and skeptics and that sort of thing. I'm like huge pro-science guy too at the time. Like, why would a pro-science guy be so ignorant? Well, that has to do with the fact that I'm equipped with a human brain. And unfortunately, it does have a lot of implicit biases and things that are in place that doesn't get one to realize real time that they're leading down a specific path where they're wrong. Because, if you're in a situation where you're wrong, it feels exactly like being right. The only time you know that you're wrong is when somebody points it out. And nobody really did that, at least not to the degree that would have like shook me out of it. And I was probably not too receptive of like any insight into that situation. So I did start eventually questioning what I like to call the quote unquote skeptics or useful idiots or whatever. And one of the reasons that got me to question them was just things that were changing in the horizon in terms of like the political climate. Like, for instance, I was following a lot of people who were in climate science and reporting very scary reality that we were facing in regards to, like, planets warming, ocean acidification, all that sort of stuff. And I was sort of pointing this out to YouTubers, saying like, why aren't we talking about climate change? Like, this kind of seems like a big deal, guys. But nobody ever took the puck, so to speak, in Canadian reference there. So you had Milo Yiannopoulos, who was sort of part of that fold, who was another person who I found to be, you know, problematic in regards to his way of thinking. I could see his cognitive dissonance like pretty clearly in the way he presented himself and that sort of stuff. I remember like talking to him about a swastika incident. Like somebody had drawn a swastika in a bathroom, and I was like, you know, bringing it to his attention, like, this is not something you just like pass off, right? Like this shouldn't happen in North America. And he just like shrugged it off. He said, you know what? All of these are usually fake. And I was like, what? What's your source for that? Aren't you a journalist? And I think at that point he,
Wow.
after I sort of like criticized him on it, he was like completely and totally dodging the critique. And he's just like, fuckity bye. He was really upset at me for just bringing it up.
So you got to interact with Milo before he got banned from Twitter, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And he was also the climate change denier, which I found out through like various I think he was on the Joe Rogan podcast at a certain point in time, and I'd watched it and I was like, really? You're a climate change denier? That's weird.
You know, when people say Joe Rogan, this is a complete aside, but do you eat a lot of Indian food?
No, I do not.
Okay, well, when I moved to the UK, I was introduced to some great Indian food, and there's a dish called Rogan Josh, and so in my head, I always want to call him Josh Rogan, not Joe Rogan, because it's kind of mixed up in my brain. Anyway, little just side note. Getting on with your story. Sorry.
Sure. So like I started seeing a pattern of sophistry at that point because, you know, the veil was kind of lifted. You had a bunch of people who were all sort of identifying as skeptics. And, you know, me having watched somebody like the amazing Randy, who has this absolutely phenomenal documentary. It's called An Honest Liar, which I recommend to everybody, just as a side note. But he had his career basically debunking people who were opportunists like Uri Geller and Peter Popoff. And what that sort of taught me is to, you know, verify sources and that sort of thing. I'd start watching, you know, Potholer 54 on YouTube as well because of the climate change nonsense that was going on. And that sort of started falling into place after that particular veil was lifted. And then you see these individuals who were supporting Donald Trump. And I was wondering, like, how the heck did we get here? It was a complete paradigm shift for me at that point in time. It's like, well, I think the marketplace of ideas is pretty much dead if we have, you know, people who are honestly calling themselves skeptics and propping up this particular presidential candidate. So at that point is when, you know, I decided to take ownership of my past positions and move forward, you know, apologizing for past behaviors and that sort of thing, which moved me to start learning about cognitive science, because I wanted to know exactly how a particular group of people would back somebody like Donald Trump. And it got me reading up on things like the backfire effect, which is an interesting phenomenon where if you're in a situation where you have, let's say, myself and a climate change denier, it doesn't matter how much evidence I bring to the table, how many facts that I bring to the table. They are always going to look at those facts and ignore them and double down. And you think it would have the opposite effect, but it doesn't. And I think that's one of the reasons why things became so polarized. And after reading up on that, it was like, well, maybe I should check this feminism stuff that I kind of brushed aside for all this time. And turns out, you know, all of the video responses that I've seen to yourself, to people like, you know, Milo Stewart, Riley Dennis, they're well sourced and they're well researched. And it was pretty stupid of me to just dismiss it. But like, at the time, I was sort of in the mind frame where, if nobody's challenging me on these positions, then I must be right, which was incredibly stupid of me. But live and learn.
Definitely live and learn. First time you do something, it's the hardest, and you'll never kind of be caught out like that again.
Yeah.
Because now you've got to sort of your skepticism, back up a little bit, I think, for claims, and you judge them in a different way than you did before. So yeah.
Well, that's one of the things about being wrong. You need to have that sort of moment where you realize you're wrong. And there's two things that could happen. You could either decide to double down on your position, which is, what a lot of people decide to do, or have it in your head that what's coming out of your mouth might not necessarily be the truth. And to always try to be vigilant with your own biases, because our brains, they're not really designed the best when it comes to having a grasp on reality.
You mentioned you listened to the lecture series by Paul Bloom on psychology, and and that's one that I also would recommend. When I had students who were sort of the super students who really enjoyed the topic and wanted to learn more outside of class besides what I prepared for the course, his lecture series was one that I would direct them to, because I think, if you want to understand behavior, when I teach research methods, I'm teaching people how to observe behavior, whether qualitatively or quantitatively, how to document it, how to be transparent, how to cite it, those kinds of things. But we don't have a lot of, and we talk about the theories that might account for it, theories of ways that we can interpret the data, different, ways of understanding what we see going on. But we don't really have time to get into the thought processes in a research methods class to do that. And political psychology would be a place for that. But for those who have an interest in understanding human behavior, I think you would also recommend the Paul Bloom series from Yale. It's Yale, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He does a phenomenal presentation. He has one guest speaker in the realm of love, which was interesting. And I just consumed the entire thing over the course of probably about a month, here and there. I'd watch a lecture, and usually it's at the end of the day when I'm sort of on my way to falling asleep, and then next day I repeat the same process. So little by little, I started picking up the concepts that were being presented. And the key theme that I keep on seeing is that we're not as smart as we think we are. And there's a lot going on in our heads that needs to be taken into account if you want to have a how would I say it, a grasp on how things are happening in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, even the basic. I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all.
But I just thanks. I want to just jump in, because one thing that I know, there were a lot of bits of the lecture series that stuck with me in terms of studies that had been done and the results of those studies, the spotlight effect and things like that. But one in particular that I think about when I'm maybe more reminded of when I'm on Twitter is this idea that when people explain events, if somebody does poorly and they're trying to account for, let's say, why a student didn't do well on a test, the people on the outside will explain that by saying, well, they didn't study, they didn't plan their time properly, they got drunk too often, whatever else, and they'll blame the person as if they had some sort of internal character flaw, or it was entirely their responsibility. If they did poorly on the same test, they would say, well, I had to take extra shifts at work, and I have these other things that I'm doing, or this isn't my best subject, or I was sick before So when it comes to accounting for our own failures, we're much more likely to provide what we'd say structural problems. Things around me happen that prevented me from doing my best. But we don't extend that empathy to others. And this is where you get into race realism. Black people are arrested more often for crimes. It must be something wrong with them.
Yeah.
as opposed to saying, hey, this, white people and black people in the States are as likely to be smoking marijuana, but black people are 3 times more likely to get arrested for the same offense. That's not, and that really stuck with me, because I see that it's not my fault, but when something bad happens to you, yes, that's definitely your fault.
Yeah.
Psychology.
So the interesting thing is then when people are sort of approaching this from the outside, looking at the actual problem, you have kind of 2 schools of thought. You have people who realize that there are deterministic causes for these things because they'll look at the statistics, and then you'll have people who go via the free will kind of an argument, which is more anecdote based. And it's like, well, I came up from a very hard life and that sort of thing, so they should be able to do the same kind of a deal. That's an argument that I've heard before, but that doesn't conform with what's happening in the real world. And that to me is a problem. That's something I'm trying to communicate to people. It's like, well, you look at something like race statistics, right? In terms of like how women are reporting those particular figures, it's very low, and there has to be like a specific reason behind that. And a lot of people would just say, well, they should just come forward. And to me, it's like, well, it can't be that easy. Otherwise, more people would have come forward in the first place. So we need to address that as a specific problem, because we are driven by, the organ that's within our skull. And the more we understand it, the better we'll be able to present solutions to these problems.
I agree. One of the things that, feminist critique of the social sciences has been throughout the sort of late 60s and 70s and beyond is that, and this is one of the critiques about the maleness of science, that coming out of the Enlightenment, not only did it have the values of observation and experimentation and replication and things like that, but it also rarefied what were considered masculine values, such as reason, logic, emotional detachment.
Mm.
And basically, science sort of wants people to be Vulcans. There's that. But the critique that feminist researchers had was, look, we can't just sort of treat people like, well, you can, but we don't think it's ethical to treat people like lab rats. Mm. We have a connection when we go and we talk to people. We have a connection with them. When you take them out of their homes and their lives and you put them in a classroom somewhere and sit them in front of a computer and give them, $5 to press a button, you're decontextualizing them. But then you want to take those results and generalize about how they behave in contexts in their everyday lives. And so there is this need for, just kind of, having a relationship, a human relationship with the people that you're studying, and understanding that they have expertises you don't have. And when you write up your findings, there's an awful, there's a tendency, there's an awful lot of speaking from this ethereal, objective voice, sort of almost that floats above the researcher, him or herself or themselves, and just says, oh, I'm doing this neutral reporting of what I saw, rather than saying, I studied this and I actually helped kind of co-create it, right? Here is my interpretation of what I saw, rather than pretending through not using I or something, or removing the self of the subject from the writing, that you're speaking from a point of objectivity. That's also an illusion that comes out of the natural science writing. So I think these were really important critiques that have pretty much been the foundation of qualitative research, which isn't credited as a feminist methodological critique sort of a solution, but that's really where the roots of it came from.
Right. That's a really interesting point, because one thing that I've noticed whenever I'm looking to try to understand certain questionable characters, like from history, I'll always approach it from kind of like critical theory kind of an aspect. And I was doing this without even thinking or knowing what critical theory was. I'm
Right.
Still sort of a neophyte when it comes to like philosophy and stuff like that.
Ah, you're at
But
the start of the journey. There's so many fun things you're going to learn.
yeah. So like let's say Ayn Rand, for instance, like instead of just reading what her philosophical positions were, I tried understanding where she came from, like what her path in life was, in order to try to contextualize that into her, how she got to the conclusions that she got to.
Right.
And a lot of times you can sort of see where people's biases are, by knowing that. Like for Ayn Rand, for instance, she was like, you know, in Stalinist Russia, and pretty much had to get out of there and come to America. So somebody who had, you know, her entire life uprooted like that might necessarily not like socialism a lot too much, even though her interpretation of socialism was really sort of narrow-minded. I mean, she only took I think like one course in school in regards to like getting her philosophy up and running.
Okay.
But her life was cinema. She was an entertainer, but she was still like, you know, presenting philosophy on top of that, and created like a structure within. And now it's like this huge thing. You have like the Ayn Rand Institute, and I actually got into a bit of an online fight with one of the individuals who's part of the Ayn Rand Institute, Mark Pellegrino, on climate change. He plays the devil in what is it, Supernatural.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's like this whole idea that altruism is evil. You know, like it's always going to lead to having a fascist dictator at the reins, and it's going to completely ruin everything. So that's part of like that whole fear, because you know you came from that sort of an area where Lenin was, you know, his ideas were at the forefront. But when you look closer, they're not exactly in line with what Marx had in mind, and it was more like a right-leaning kind of a socialism. David Pakman had a great video sort of dissecting socialism, what it is, what it isn't, that sort of stuff. But like her view was like entirely absolutist. And that's another thing. Anytime somebody brings up like a term that's sort of like absolutist, like altruism is evil, and they don't see like the shades of gray, that to me it seems like an oversimplification.
It seems a bit too much like a faith statement rather than a philosophical one. You know,
because there's a lot of shades of gray.
Yeah, I mean, I was basically the sort of introduced not to Ayn Rand, but her ideas through actual philosophers studying, or people studying actual philosophers. And yeah, she doesn't have a very good, she's not really seen as a rigorous philosophical mind, even though quite a lot of people are fans of her work. But it seems to me the Ayn Rand Institute would be similar to the Creation Institute in terms of its academic rigor and output. Yeah. But it is a philosophy that allows people to justify being shit to other people.
It's entirely selfish and narcissistic. So in terms of other things that I've noticed that are sort of absolutist is this pejorative in terms of authority. Like people who are saying that, well, if you want to make changes to, like, let's say the Bill C-16 over here in Canada, for instance, which just added 2 lines, by the way. One was in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The other one was in the Criminal Code, and it's gender identity and expression among the protected classes. That's it. That's the whole thing.
Right.
And people will call that authoritarian.
Yeah.
Which is bizarre to me, because it's pretty much like liberty and authoritarian principles kind of go hand in hand. If you want to protect somebody's liberty, You either do it through action or inaction. So to call something authoritarian, I consider that more of a gradient. It's like, well, how authoritarian is this particular policy?
And from my understanding of the way that the process works, and I think I was listening to one of your videos on it, it's a deliberative process. It's not like the government comes in and stamps down. There has to be a complaint filed, and people are just talked to, and the situation, the context are taken into account, and then there's a finding, and so yeah, if people were being hauled off to jail, yeah, that would be authoritarian, but that's not what's happening, and just because they're using authority. The authority of the state to enforce it, that doesn't mean it's necessarily authoritarian, as you point out.
Because in a sense, you need to take something like theft, for instance. You could call that authoritarian. You steal somebody's property, well, you go to jail. It's two liberties coming into conflict. It's the person who wants to take your stuff and the person who wants to keep their stuff protected. And whenever you have two people's sort of liberty to do whatever they want that comes into conflict like that, you have a paradox of absolute freedom. So, for instance, let's say you have somebody who's transgendered, right? And they are taking a class, and in that class you have Jordan Peterson. And Jordan Peterson refuses to call them by their appropriate, pronoun. And he continues to do this because he decides that it's his right to speak however he wants. Well, then you're going to have a conflict because you have Jordan Peterson's irrational contempt for the other person and the other person's liberty to, be treated like anybody else in the world.
Can you speak a bit more to that concept of irrational contempt? I think it's a very interesting one, but I don't know a lot about it.
Well, there's no real reason why you wouldn't go and use somebody's appropriate pronoun. It's like this really insignificant thing that we do on a day-to-day basis anyways. Like we use our given names. Like you're Dr. Kristi, I'm Pascal, and if we extend that particular liberty to each other without even thinking about it, what's a pronoun going to do? Like, it's not like you're going to have to memorize the entire list of pronouns. A lot of people just go with he, they, or she, and that's it. If you happen to find somebody who has the Z pronoun, ooh, 2 letters, very, very scary. I'd call them Z. Like, I'm not going to bump into a lot of people who are going to make that request. And I'll be like, sure, why not? What's the big deal?
So it sounds like part of the irrational calculation here is the demands being put on the person who's being expected to conform their behavior so as to not be a dick to the other person. So again, the context is taken into account here, and the fact that the logic seems to be you're willing to do it for everyone else, but you stop here.
Yeah.
And there is no good reason to stop here, so you can't stop here.
Exactly.
Kind of thing.
And it's this whole,
and it's not hauling people into also just to say, it's not hauling people off the streets. These are like business situations where people have employment power or coworkers could harass. These are like not necessarily you're walking down the street and someone insults you and then the cops come and grab you and haul you down to the interrogation center, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, exactly. So it has to be like a persisted thing. Like somebody is not going to go out of their way to report somebody just because they mistakenly misgendered them, like out of the blue. Like people make mistakes sometimes. And let's say, for the sake of argument, we have somebody who's walking down the street and he sees somebody and he misgenders them. And that person goes, you know what? I'm taking your ass to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And, they do that. While the tribunal is going to be reviewing that particular case in regards to what led up to the event. And let's say, again, for the sake of argument, they don't dismiss it outright because it's silly. and the guy or girl finds themselves in front of the tribunal, they will be asked to sort of explain what their intent was. They specifically ask, what was your intent? So at that point in time, if you say, well, you know what, my intent was, I messed up. I didn't know. Sorry. And if that's still not good enough, let's say for the sake of argument, once again, we still have a person who's having a bad day, who's working for the tribunal and is deciding, hey, you know what? I'm gonna make an example of this person. Well, there's still an appeals process that you could do in order to reverse the changes. So there's a lot of checks and balances in place to avoid that kind of abuse from happening. But people like Jordan Peterson would have you believe that it's going to destroy Western civilization because we're losing our rights to free speech, and he should be able to say whatever he wants.
I think the anti-authoritarianism, or the let's say opposition to authority, seems to really only come down on issues that attack the status quo. When it comes to reforming the judicial system and addressing inherent racial biases and even sexist biases, that men get longer sentences than women. Mm-hmm. They'll talk, yeah, we should do that one. But if you want to talk about longer sentences and then say, but we should especially look at the fact that black men get much longer sentences than white guys, then they're going to go, oh, no. What are you bringing your social justice into men's issues?
Right. Yeah. And
so it's rather selective.
There's another disconnect where it's like we should be able to say whatever we want. And here's something that I found kind of odd. So you're for the concept of free speech, right? And in order to say that, well, words shouldn't matter. Persons should be able to get over themselves. Well, that's sort of directly in conflict with the concept of free speech as well, because if you want free speech to be protected, then you're automatically recognizing that words do matter and they have power. You see what I mean?
Yeah. How do you think you understood? How do you think that they? What would you summarize? Sorry to stumble over my words, but I'm trying to encapsulate this off the cuff. Their idea, the antis, their notion of free speech and the logic of it. How would you describe it as operating? Like, what is their base value system in your perception?
For the antis. For like the people who are championing free speech?
Well, yeah, on YouTube. Yeah, the whole, that crowd. I don't want to name names, but right. I think, we talk about that and the people who talk about free speech the most. What's your perception of their understanding or concept of it?
Well, they don't understand the paradox of absolute freedom. So they don't see the other individual whose rights and liberties are being infringed upon. They only see the one individual. And I think that's where the disconnect is.
Do you think it's that they see themselves? It's not even a sort of abstract individual, but if they're talking about their rights as being superseding other people's rights to not be harassed or targeted?
I think it's more or less that they see their own behaviors, so kind of being mirrored, like they're shit stirrers. In a sense, and they want their particular right to do whatever they want and say whatever they want to be protected. I think it's also that they don't like anybody butting in and making specific laws in regards to speech in general. But I think their concept of free speech is a little simplistic, and I think a lot of the things that they come to their conclusions is very simplistic. Like, for example, you look at how black people are having a hard time of it in regards to being in very difficult climates when it comes to where they grow up and that sort of thing, and they're just essentially living in poverty, and people in their frame of mind will just look at various different statistics and they'll say, oh, look, they're all in single homes. They come from single parent homes. That's got to be it. And they'll point the finger. And that's where it ends. You see, for me, I'm like, well, why are they in single parent homes? And I start asking questions, thinking, well, maybe it's because the incarceration rates for Black people are so high, and their father's in jail, or it could just be a situation in that particular environment because there aren't enough jobs in that section. A whole bunch of other factors I start asking about, but their line of thinking stops like right there.
Cause effect. We have the answer. There you go, people. We're done here. Getting back to the idea of authority, because we talked about their opposition in terms of C16 to government interference, but the free speechers, maybe that's a better way to call them, they also extend that notion of free speech beyond government regulation to terms of service of a private company providing a platform to the public to make money. And the idea that the rules that are being enforced on Twitter or in other places are unfair and unjust and suppress their free speech. And not only does that ethos extend to the companies, but also to the individuals who want to be free from that kind of toxic environment and report. So there is a value system that you shouldn't report people who harass you or who post horrible things because you're suppressing their free speech, or you're targeting them, or they're a victim of your cry bullying.
Right.
So it seems to go, it's not just about a legal principle. That defensiveness it kind of extends to anything that you want to criticize them on, or not even criticize them on, but hold them accountable for when they cross a line.
Right.
And so it seems to me less about a principle and more about it's a catchphrase to cover the aims which are, I want to say whatever hurtful things I want without any consequences.
Yeah, it's wanting to be free of accountability.
Right. Yeah, it's not free speech. It's the free of accountability movement.
Yeah, it's like you look at it with like a lot of individuals have been sort of realizing that they're like YouTubers. Their particular business model is not going to have longevity, so they're starting to build bridges towards various different people. However, the problem with that is that they haven't taken any accountability for their past actions. Like for me, it's really important to own what I say. It's why I don't play, on the internet as some role player with like a cartoon avatar or anything like that. I put my name out there. I put my face out there. That way I know if I'm telling somebody something, that can come back to me. And I have to live with that. And I think that a lot of people, they have a problem with that for whatever reason, but they still want to be, they want people to just not pay attention to what they're sweeping under the rug in terms of like what they've done during, to get where they were.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
For instance, I keep bringing up Riley Dennis and Milo Stewart. I mean, these are two individuals who are going through a rough time of it because, statistically speaking, people within their demographic, they'll have 42 to 45% chance to have a suicide attempt.
Yep.
That's really high.
Yes.
And to put themselves out there, have an online presence, and to decide to bring a channel to the forefront, to help people who are in their situation have an understanding of what it's like. That's not easy. And when you have every single person who's on a specific crew, who's making a video that's just complete sophistry. There's no sources. It's just a shit show. Compared to the work that they've put in terms of sourcing their information and that sort of stuff, it's not right. Yeah.
I think on that point, there is a moral deficiency on the part of a lot of people in the freedom from responsibility or accountability side of things. Sadly, that doesn't really trip off the tongue. Otherwise, it would be a great phrase.
Right.
But sorry, the thing that you were talking about. Sorry, I lost my train of thought because I was trying to hold on to yours and then take it in another direction. But on the moral accountability here, yeah, you have a sense of your moral obligation to your fellow human beings and to yourself.
Right.
I find that people who claim to play characters or create channels based on an exaggerated, not real version of themselves, where they play up to things and then get kind of caught up in the values and ethos of that character being attached to them personally, those creators don't seem to as often. Well, they are selective about when they admit they're wrong. They're selective under the circumstances under which they say they were wrong. And a lot of times they'll, like backtrack or delete their tweets if they mess up, or double down on them. Yeah. And instead of admitting their how much they hurt people. So I think that's one factor that distinguishes you from them. But there's also the real challenge. I think we're going to look back to the sort of 2013 to 2015, 16 time as the golden age of YouTube shitlords, because it was before the adpocalypse. It was before a lot of the demonetization policies. It was before Patreon. I think there's a lot of people who do count on small contributors in those circles who are going to be hit by this stuff. And as you say, the business model that they came up on and got used to that as how they made their money, it's been changing under their feet. And some of them are adapting and some of them aren't. And one person in particular, like you said, diversifying their content and trying to have more conversations. I think the problem with that business model is that when you cultivate an audience based on throwing them red meat, and suddenly you give them vegetables along with them, you're not giving them the drama and the simplistic narrative and somebody to hate.
Right.
When you bring on real people and you have real conversations, some people might get into that, but for those who aren't, they're just going to stop coming back because it's not the content that they want to see. So I think, yeah, the shitlords have an oversaturated market. Not only the big players, but also their copycat sycophants on a lower tier to them, where it's basically the same formula, the same format, the same drama. And yeah, I think the next couple of years are going to be quite challenging for those channels.
A term that I really like is coattail passenger.
Can you explain that concept a bit, just so I have it accurately?
Essentially, like, back in the old days, you'd have this coat and it would have a split in the middle, right where your butt is, and it would have like little flaps. And coattail passengers is somebody who's sitting on the flaps of, like, the rich, powerful person, which in this case would be, Milo Yiannopoulos. Because when he started coming in is when I noticed, like, everything started changing. People were going towards this, like, huge Breitbart kind of a narrative, and basically mirroring every single thing that he was saying. And interestingly enough, it recently came out on BuzzFeed that he was working hand in hand with the alt-right in terms of getting their message across, which is
surprise.
Kind of why you started seeing a lot of quote unquote alt-right. I just call them Nazis at this point. Yeah. I don't like breaking the distinction. And it's like, look, you have so many different flags that all went to Charlottesville at this point. Yeah, you're all Nazis. Let's not mince words.
Hear, hear. Yeah, so what else? You said you had a list. We've just been chatting sort of enjoyably, but were the topics you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I'm pretty much done. Like, I covered everything that I wanted to. If you happen to have anything.
No. I don't know if you wanted to talk at all about epistemology.
Ooh, yeah, I'm still sort of like trying to sort that out, to be honest. And one of the resources that I've been using is PBS's sort of it has like a series on philosophy, and epistemology is like one of the topics they cover, and I'll probably look for other introductory courses on that. but I'm still not whole. Like my brain hasn't compartmentalized the what it is. It's like it's knowing what we know kind of a
Right.
deal.
Well, do you want me to chat a bit about it?
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
If you can like unpack that, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Well, of course, I'm not a professional philosopher, so all of the
Right.
opinions said here are the amateur spoutings of an autodidact mostly. But I think it's easier to start if we take a step back to ontology. The ontology is the study of or the investigation of what exists. And the two main schools of thought there are things exist, sort of materially, or things exist through construction. And that's not to say that there's one or the other. It depends on kind of how you want to look at it. So how could that possibly be? Well, if you think about, we conceptualize the idea of a tree. We tend to go on its material being. So we look at the roots and we look at the bark and we look at the branches and the leaves and we say, okay, this discrete thing here is a tree. But if we came at it from the perspective of, say, chemistry, where the water gets exchanged, where the photosynthesis takes place, where the oxygen is released and carbon dioxide is taken in, you wouldn't have the same sort of structure of a tree that you have by going on a purely material thing. So that's to say that things exist for us sometimes because we construct ways for them to exist, in addition to material existence, right? So sometimes, it's a little bit arbitrary. In this case, it makes sense for us visually to organize a tree like that because it corresponds to how we perceive a tree. We don't perceive the chemistry. We perceive it materially. So then if we know that there are more than one ways there's multiple ways things can exist, or at least more than one way for things to exist, then the question becomes epistemology. How can we know about what we think exists? And that's the study of what are the best methods and approaches to investigating the world. And from a causal perspective, like in the social sciences, you say the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. That's a quantitative, measurable sort of causal relationship, almost more like the natural sciences, that you want to look at. If you want to understand how people conceive of voting as they age and the different motivations that actually get them to the polls the older they get, you would want to look at the way they construct their notions of civic duty or paying taxes or life experiences or the role of government in their lives.
Wow.
So, right? Do you get that now?
Yeah. No, it's like everything that's been framed in respect to social scientists just kind of like came into focus. Yeah.
Right. And then the next question there is methodologies. What are the best tools or approaches of investigation? What are the appropriate ways to go about collecting data on the phenomenon the way we think it exists?
I see. Okay.
Right. And then you've sort of got your individual tools, your methods. So you can have a quantitative methodology or a qualitative methodology or mixed methods or an experimental methodology. And then your methods might be running an experiment or conducting a survey or doing an interview. That's your method.
Okay. So just out of curiosity, I saw your stream regarding August. And you had a really interesting discussion in that regards. How would the social sciences approach that particular situation?
It would depend on what level you were talking about. So the individual level might be psychological. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to understand the influence of the groups on the individual, then it would be social psychology.
Okay.
And then you could also look at the patterns of how people behave, more in the aggregate, and that would be sociology.
Okay. Because I was thinking because a sex worker who's female in the porn industry is a pretty specific target if people are going with substance abuse and has depression. Is it attracting people who have depression? I have all sorts of questions in that regards.
I think if there is sociological work on that would be the field that would probably do it. Also, maybe in combination with psychology. But I think, yes, there's higher rates of sexual abuse in the history of all sex workers or people in the sex industry or the adult industry. That's, I think, a pretty well-established empirical fact.
Okay.
Yeah.
because that's another thing. I find it rather ironic that individuals who would bring up her as an example of harassment and to just stop it there and blaming like the social justice warriors, and they've been sort of demonizing the very science that can actually help to fix that particular situation or find solutions for it at least. So
yeah, there's a lot of paradoxes in their thinking. If you just follow them long enough, you can get tweets that don't age well very quickly.
Yeah, that's essentially what's happening right now. Like I see my time. Oh, there's another one from that person.
Yeah. No, it is really, I think, very powerful on Twitter when you get someone like Ian Miles Chong talking about how awful bullying is, and then putting him another quote that he put up in a different situation saying, "Now bullying builds character."
Yeah, there's absolutely no consistency. They're using motivated reasoning for whatever sounds best for whatever situation they're in. Like I don't know how you can operate like that, because I like consistency. I mean,
yeah, I find cognitive dissonance very disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, if ever I've done something like that, I sure would like to have it pointed out, because then I'd feel kind of silly, and I'd reevaluate my position and evolve as a human being. But that's just me. Like,
right. And I think, oh, go ahead, finish up, and then I'll make my point.
Yeah, one of my favorite things is being proven wrong. I know it's a little weird, but it's like, man, I don't get to be dumb anymore on this particular topic. This is great.
You do very well learning German then, because you wouldn't be embarrassed about your mistakes. You're just like, oh, yeah. Thank you for correcting me. I'm so happy. But yeah, the point was, just to get back to that hypocrisy. I, for instance, I've been experiencing a false flag, which was absolute crap. It was not a situation where the content should have been flagged down. It was bullying. It wasn't a substantive flag. And I think recently Kraut had a video critical of the alt-right. He had bullied down because people were complaining, even though the content didn't warrant the flag. Now, I came to that one late, and I didn't make a video on it. And I did end up tweeting at him that I would watch the video with an eye toward mirroring it. But by the time I did that, he had already, the problem had been solved. Right. But that didn't mean that because it happened to Kraut, I didn't care about the flagging. So, there's also, it's one thing when you take a position, like in that case, false flags are crap. And then that doesn't mean I have to speak out on every single instance of a flagging and judge whether or not it's false every single time it happens. I can have the principle, but not always comment on it and be consistent. But if you do something like, say, bullying builds character, and then later on saying bullying people is terrible, well, then you're not being consistent. That's not just like you not commenting on something or not having an opinion on it. That's actually you saying two different things depending on who the object of your criticism is.
Yeah, exactly. And just a tip, if you happen to be somebody named Ian and fall into these traps regularly, you always have the recourse of saying, you know what, I was wrong about this.
Yep.
Sorry. I think this position, like in the past, I might have said something like this. This position seems a lot better now. But let's move forward with this,
Yeah, but there's a monetary reason that people don't do that. And so the problem will, unfortunately, I think, persist. It'll change, it'll evolve, it will morph, but the fundamental core of that industry will remain because there's a market for it.
Yeah, well, I'm not so sure now because, what, they have another 3 years of this? Because here's the thing. If I wanted to prove that feminism is bad, and I had sort of an engine that was behind me like Breitbart, I could easily do that. It's not that difficult because you're dealing with 7 billion people on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
How many of those are feminists? And how many of those are feminists who have acted poorly?
Right.
So you keep on coming up with these examples where, oh, look, this person's doing this. How dare they? And, oh, look, here's another person doing this. And at the end of the day, you will have your narrative that feminism is bad. And you could even go so far and to say that feminism is going to destroy Western civilization as you put on your little tinfoil hat and do a dance. But you can do that with any demographic. It's not difficult. So what people need to ask themselves, instead of looking for specific examples like that, well, where exactly is this happening? What are the policies that the government is pushing that are going to be authoritarian? And you look and it's like not really that big of a deal.
Generally,
and
yeah, in comparison to things that are happening, like climate science trying to be scrubbed from the web, them trying to push faith schools through the Department of Education in the U.S., the Trump rolling back a rule that now allows members of the clergy to talk politics from the pulpit and use more religious money in order to influence elections. And yeah, you're worried about what's happening on one campus in one state.
Exactly. And the whole reason why we don't see much in terms of like feminists being bad these days is because the entire engine is on damage control for that imbecile in the White House. That's why they think that, oh, well, the social justice warrior problem has been solved. Well, not really. If you're talking about the same problem you were looking at before, it's not being reported on. And if you look at the social policies that people are suggesting, these are actually moving towards solutions if you actually bother to listen and look at sources and, have an open mind when it comes to these particular positions, which, I've recently had because of my trip down cognitive sciences and that sort of thing, and my paradigm shift and all of that sort of stuff. So,
yeah, and I think hearing your story and other people's who sort of started off in that community and then kind of got woke and sat up and from the matrix and decided to think for yourself and look around the world. It's not like you've automatically become a flaming progressive, like screaming racism at everything. You're thinking for yourself, you're looking at arguments, and you're being cautious. And I think that's pretty much that's the mindset we want, combined with, some empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. It's not that reasonable. People can disagree on basic points, but if we all agree broadly on the values, then what we should be debating are the best ways to solve the problems. Not always debating the definition of the difference between earnings and wages in the wage gap supposed myth.
And there's a concept that I like called and I kind of coined this. I don't know if anybody else did before me. It's quite possible just because of the sheer number of people we have on the earth, and no idea is quote unquote original. But intellectual parity. What I mean by that is that you have a discussion between people in regards to climate science these days, and in the United States, it's does it actually exist? Or if you're a little bit, closer to accepting the fact that climate change is real, is it man-made versus, yes, we know it's happening. Yes, it's man-made, and that sort of thing. When you're having that kind of a discussion or debate, the only person that has anything to gain from that is the denier. And the climate scientist has everything to lose. And they're not at intellectual parity because the problem still persists. We're not providing solutions to that problem. What we need two people on the same page who are realizing that climate change is occurring and it's us that's causing it, in order to have the debate on the solutions to what we need to implement. I think that happens like a lot, because if people are sort of denying that, social sciences plays a very important role in terms of determining how we solve very complicated problems, they're not at intellectual parity with everybody else because they're oversimplifying things and they're completely denying the academic sort of veracity of what's being presented. I mean, I don't have to understand physics to know, the various things that have been reported by physics. Other scientific institutions should be given the same credit because these are people who are applying their entire lives and careers. They go to school, they specialize. Then there's other hoops they go through. They finally get their paper co-authored with like various different people, and then it goes up for peer review. It's like this insane process to have anything out there. And you're going to tell me that they have done this how many times in regards to like climate science and stuff like that, and they got it all wrong? I don't think so.
That's certainly the case that, I think a lot of conversations have that problem of false parity. There is I don't know, I have heard of that concept before. It's usually when I read about the impact of, just as you say, the impact of having two people debate something like climate change, where you have a person who's got a degree and published papers and knows what they're talking about, and another person with a religious agenda. And you put them on a panel together and you give them equal time and you give the audience the impression that their values, their opinions are of equal weight.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And a lot of times I see this happening in the YouTube conversations where you'll get somebody in a conversation like the Destiny no bullshit debate, okay. and Destiny can say whatever he wants that's reasonable, and no bullshit can come up with incredibly insane hypotheticals, and people will say, oh yeah, you guys had a good discussion, each person made really good points. You're like, no, only one person made good points. The other person was full of shit and didn't know how to debate. Yeah, and so that's kind of a problem of false equivalence or false parity, as you were saying, in terms of the audience unfortunately, just not really appreciating the difference between the claims of two different parties when one is based on evidence and the other one is just sort of like making it up as they go.
Yeah, but me, the term intellectual parity was more in regards to that in order to progress to the next stage, which would be solving the problem and debating on what solutions are necessary for that. Like, for instance, let's say you have like a Republican and a Democrat, and they're both on board with climate change. Well, one could be arguing for cap and trade. The other one could be arguing for corporate tax breaks for whichever companies are going green. Have that kind of incentive behind it, and it can come up with whatever aligns with whatever party politically. But instead, we have one person who's saying no and doing everything to make sure that nothing gets done on that front, versus the other one who's sort of trying to get something like healthcare passed, and they do a half-assed job of it.
Yep. Agreed. So, yeah, was there anything else that has come up that you wanted to chat about?
No, climate change is real, and yes. you should all become very informed on that front.
And epistemology is cool.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, this has been great. I hope you stick around after I do the sign off. We can have a little chat off air before we wrap it up. But for those of you who are watching, we're going to bring this to an end now. So thank you so much for your time and attention, everyone. And all that's left to be said is that I've been Kristi. Pascal has been awesome. You, the viewers, have been awesome. And goodbye from me and goodbye from Pascal. Say goodbye, Pascal.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.